Hello and welcome to Lecture 5 of the Classical Era. Today I'm going to talk about some slight differences in the structure of the movements of a concerto, and then I'll talk a little bit about the life and career of Franz Joseph Haydn, and in subsequent lectures I will also talk about Mozart and about Beethoven, and then we will wrap this unit up. Last lecture, we talked about what to expect in the third movement of a four-movement work and in the finale of any multi-movement instrumental work of the classical era. And remember I said that, of course, we have some works that are three-movement, some works that are four-movement, but if we have a three-movement work, it is the third out of the four that is missing, and that is the dance-like movement. So in a concerto, first thing to remember is we don't have that dance-like movement, the minuet and trio or scherzo and trio that's in ternary form. That's the one that's missing. So a concerto, as it had been in the Baroque era, is a three-movement work. The first movement will be in sonata form, but with some little modifications, some little tweaks. The second movement will be slow and in some other form, and the last movement will be fast again, and most likely in rondo form. So let's start with the differences that we can expect to find in the first movement. So in sonata form, remember, we have three main sections. The exposition, which is repeated, right, like in the first movement of a symphony or a string quartet. That exposition is always played through exactly the same twice. In fact, it isn't even written out again. You get to the end of that exposition and there's a sign there that tells you to repeat and play the whole exposition one more time. And then we get into the development section and then the recapitulation. We may also have a coda on the end of any piece of music, but that's not standard, it's not necessary, it's optional. So we'll just kind of not consider that one of the sort of main structural sections. In a concerto, since a concerto is a work for a soloist and orchestra, instead of having a single exposition which is played through twice, we actually have two separate written out expositions that each get played through once. So in a concerto, we have something called double exposition sonata form. The first of these two expositions is just for the orchestra. And the second exposition, which contains all the same themes in the same order, like the first theme, the bridge, the second theme, the closing theme, has all that same material, but instead of being presented only by the orchestra, in the second exposition, the soloist joins in. And remember, the idea of a concerto is that the soloist is really the featured star. He or she will be actually in front of the orchestra, and the orchestra will be in back, and the orchestra's role is more to accompany the soloist. So that means that if you're listening to a concerto, like on a CD, and you can't see the performers, you might not realize that it's a concerto until maybe 3 or 4 minutes in, because for the first 3 or 4 minutes, all you're hearing is the orchestra going through the orchestral exposition. Then we get to the second exposition, where the soloist makes his or her entrance and interacts with the orchestra. Sometimes the soloist will present themes, and the orchestra will kind of like answer back with them. Themes are kind of exchanged between the different instruments of the orchestra and the soloist. And of course, remember, the idea of a concerto is to give the soloist an opportunity to sort of show off their virtuosity. So there will be lots of like technically dazzling and difficult sections. So there might be sort of versions of this thematic material which have lots of extra notes, embellishment, ornamentation, what have you, because that's really the point. It's a showpiece. That's what a concerto is. Okay, so we have this double exposition form. Then we get into the development section, and here we find the usual things that we would expect in a development section. The soloist does play with the orchestra, and we have the sort of breakdown of the themes maybe into motives and reconfiguring themes, perhaps in polyphonic texture. We're going to modulate through different keys, and in the development we will have the sort of the emotional climax, the high point of the overall movement. Also, given that we are trying to build tension and break down themes, etc., that this also might be a place for lots of technical display, dazzling finger work, what have you. And then we get into the recapitulation. And remember, the recapitulation is when we bring our original themes back but stay in that home key rather than travel to different keys, because we're getting toward the end of the movement now. We need to get back to that original home key. Toward the end of the recapitulation, like just before the closing theme or the coda, this is the one other different feature that we really only find in a concerto, and that is the cadenza. So sometime, let's say, like toward the end of the second theme or the closing theme, what will happen is the entire orchestra will come to a cadence. In fact, that's where we get the name cadenza. It's just the Italian word for cadence. It will come to a stop or a pause. And the soloist, whatever instrument they're playing, keyboard, violin, flute, trumpet, whatever it is, will then present maybe a 1 or 2 or 3 minute long improvised solo. And the idea is, and I should say quasi-improvised, because it really would have been improvised like back in the time of the that we're talking about here in the classical era and on into the 1800s. It was expected that performers would be able to improvise. That's not so much the practice anymore in classical music. That's certainly something we find in jazz. Most classical musicians today don't do very much improvising on stage, but then it was expected that the orchestra could come to a stop and the soloist would take some of that thematic material that we'd already heard in the preceding sections and improvise a solo and sort of weave these different themes together. Also, again, showing off their technical skill, dazzling the audience. Okay? These would have been improvised back in the day, but composers also sometimes wrote out a cadenza so that in case someone else was playing the piece, maybe a student who didn't have that same skill at improvisation, or maybe future performers, so that they would have something to play in case they themselves were maybe not capable of this level of improvisation. In that case, the composer would write out a cadenza, but even if written out, it would be written out in such a way that it sounded as if it were improvised. It would sound spontaneous and unpredictable and have different twists and turns and modulations to unexpected keys and all this kind of thing. So that's a cadenza. We almost always find a cadenza at the end of the first movement. We sometimes find a cadenza also at the end of the last movement, the finale of a concerto. Now, how about the second movement? Second movement of a concerto, there's really nothing different in particular. It's going to be slow, it's going to be lyrical. There probably will not be as much kind of like technical show-off kind of stuff, because the slow movement is supposed to be lyrical. It's going to be very beautiful, very melodic, what have you, but perhaps not as much technical display. Then we get the last movement. And as I said, the last movement is likely to be in rondo form, but again, because this is a piece for soloist and orchestra, it's a rondo with a slight difference in that it will have an extra A and B section. Remember, the whole idea of the rondo is we go back and forth between A, and that A material keeps coming back around, but in between the reappearances we have contrasting material, which we could call B or C. Right? Well, in a concerto, in the last movement of a concerto, if it's a rondo, the first A and B are presented by the orchestra in the same way that the first exposition in the first movement will be presented by the orchestra alone. So we have an orchestral A and B, and then the soloist comes in and then we have an A and B with the soloist. So far we have A, B, and then a return of A, and then a C section. And then we will either end with A, if it's a short rondo, right? Or remember, there's also the possibility of a long rondo where we bring back B one more time. If we bring back B, however, we have to bring back A because we got to end with the same material we began with, the A material. We may also have tacked onto the end of that a coda. Coda is a concluding section, doesn't necessarily have to be there, but it might be there. So that means if we have a long rondo, for example, in this example in your listening, the last movement, rondo finale of the trumpet concerto in E flat major by Franz Joseph Haydn, you can look down the left-hand column and they show where these different sections are and exactly which track number they, sorry, how many minutes and seconds into the work. And if you recite them all, it's A, B, A, development, A, B, coda. So that development, shouldn't that be C? Well, it kind of is. They labeled it as development. They could have also put a C in there and maybe put development in parentheses because this is an example of a sonata rondo. So this is another a possibility that I mentioned last time. Sometimes in a rondo form, in which the middle section is always C, right? Sometimes that middle section, instead of introducing new themes, develops existing themes. It has the function of a development section. Again, akin to the development section in sonata form. So that is the case in this particular example. It's not always going to be the case, but in this particular example, this is not just a rondo, it's a sonata rondo. And again, remember, the definition of a sonata rondo is simply when we have a rondo in which the C section has developmental characteristics. Right? Okay, so having said all that, we will listen to this final movement of this trumpet concerto, and I'm just going to say a little bit about it. Composed, as the book says, around 1800, and it was composed specifically because a friend of Haydn's, who was a trumpet player, had invented a new type of trumpet that had keys on it, and of course modern trumpets have their own version of this kind of thing. They have valves, and this was a new thing. And in fact, this trumpet concerto would not have been playable on the older style of trumpet that did not have valves. As you might have kind of guessed or imagined, the purpose of the valves on the trumpet is actually to allow air to go into certain sections of tubes or not, and that either lengthens or shortens the overall length of the column of air that is inside that trumpet. Now that column of air, it's all going to be kind of like twisted up in these tubes, but you can think of it as sort of like a vibrating string, any kind of a vibrating medium, right? And in the trumpet, it just happens to be a column of air that's doing the vibrating. Well, if you don't have the valves to control exactly the length of that column of air, then the only notes you can play are the notes that correspond to the overtone series of that particular length. So you can play, a given note, like the entire speaking length of the trumpet, or if you tighten your lips in such a way, you can activate half of that length, or 1/3 of that length, 1/4, 1/5, etc., and that's how you get the intervals that correspond to the overtone series. But those are the only notes that you can get unless you have valves to get lengths that do not correspond to those fractions in the overtone series. So, kind of a technical explanation, but this trumpet concerto was written specifically to exploit the possibilities of this new design of trumpet that has keys on it, that can control the length of the different subsets of tubes and control the overall length of the vibrating column of air inside the trumpet. The performer in this recording is Wynton Marsalis, who is a great master of both classical and jazz trumpet. And we will listen to this, and I will make some little commentary as we go. Notice that even though this movement has many sections, right? It's a long rondo, sonata rondo, but it's the 7-part rondo, right? With an additional 2 parts, iterations of A and B at the very beginning, and with a coda at the end. And that coda is basically, it does double duty as the last iteration of A. Notice that goes right from B to the coda. That's because that last A section is really kind of like A/coda. Nonetheless, that's a lot of sections, so you'd think this would be a long piece of music. It's actually quite short because each individual section is pretty short. And the tempo is fast, it's allegro, so it'll go by fairly quickly. Let's see if we can conjure it up here on the machine. Okay, so this is the A theme. And it's happy, chipper, upbeat, typical classical theme. And it gets restated. But so far, no trumpet, just the orchestra. This is the B theme. Yum, ba-da-da-da-bum. Then we have a little closing section that leads us to A. So this is the A melody being played by the soloist. And it gets restated. Now we're moving to closely related key. We hear the B theme. Very rapid notes. That would have been impossible on the older style of trumpet. So we're still basically in that second B section. And a return of A. So coming up next is the development section. So we don't really have a new theme. We have the existing A theme being developed, being taken through different keys. We have this kind of increasing drama, suspense. Not sure what comes next. Oh, there it is. It's the A material coming back. And B. This is our B material. Back in the home key. And again, we have a sort of a little transition passage here. Then we hear our main theme come back. So this is both A and a coda. It's a coda made out of the A material, with some additional flourishes. And there you go. So, having just listened to this work by Haydn, that'll be a good sort of segue into a little discussion of Haydn's life and times in his career. And what I'm going to do actually with these three composers, and again, there are more than three composers in the classical era, but everyone pretty much agrees that these three that we're focusing on are kind of head and shoulders above the rest: Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. I'm going to do some compare and contrast, sort of like what I did with J.S. Bach and George Frederick Handel. But the difference is, in the case of Bach and Handel, although they were born in the same year, 1685, they were both organists primarily. They were born not even too far away from each other in northern Germany. Their careers took different paths for various reasons that I went into back when I discussed this in the previous unit. And the reason their careers took various different paths, there were reasons, but they weren't the same reasons as, I would say, the reasons that Haydn's, Mozart's, and Beethoven's careers were so different. The reason I think for the differences, some of the main differences between Haydn's, Mozart's, and Beethoven's careers is the fact that the times that they lived in, they were born at different times, and this period in which they're living is a time of tremendous sort of social upheaval and change that affects everybody, including musicians, including the way that musicians make a living. So that's part of the reason. It's not the only reason, but it's part of the reason that their lives and careers were quite different from each other. So Haydn is the earliest, the oldest of these three. He was born in 1732, the same year as George Washington, the father of his country. Haydn was, as the book mentions, considered the father of the symphony and the father of the string quartet. Although he did not invent either of those genres, he is known as the father of the symphony, the father of the string quartet, because probably more than anyone else, he sort of set the rules or the paradigm or the template, what have you, for what a symphony is or what a string quartet is. He sort of set the stylistic practices that later composers, especially Mozart and Beethoven, both of whom were greatly influenced by Haydn, he sort of set the course that later composers would take. Haydn, first thing to know about him is he was born into a very humble background. His family were not professional musicians, although they were apparently gifted amateur musicians. His father was a good folk musician, apparently could play the harp, and there was always music in the Haydn household. But what Haydn's father did for a living was he was a guy who made wagon wheels. He was a wheelwright. And Haydn was born, I believe, the oldest of 12 children in a little village called Rorau, which in those days, I believe it was on the border between the Austrian and Hungarian parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember this big empire in the middle of Europe with its capital in Vienna, play a very important role in the lives of all three of these composers. So when Haydn was, I believe, like 5 or 6 years old, he was sent to live with a relative in Hamburg, Germany, who it was thought could provide an education for him, especially maybe even a musical education, because they showed some musical talent. So at age 5 or 6, he left home, was sent to live with this, I'm not sure even how close a relative it was, whether it was an uncle or something like that, and never returned home again, actually. So he lived for a time in Hamburg, and then it just so happened that the choir master of the main big cathedral in Vienna, which is still there to this day, St. Stephen's Cathedral, all of these big Catholic churches needed boy sopranos, because remember the old rule that women are not supposed to sing in church, so who's going to sing the high parts? Boy sopranos. The problem with boy sopranos is eventually their voices change, and that means you need a constant new supply of boy sopranos to replace the ones whose voices changed and are no longer able to sing those parts. So apparently the choir master of St. Stephen's in Vienna would make these trips and would inquire as to where, would maybe go to schools or whatever, and would inquire where there might be some, children with some singing ability, some musical talent. And this is kind of like how Haydn was discovered by the choir master of St. Stephen's. And this was when he was about 6 or 7 years old. So he then left Hamburg and went down to Vienna and spent the next roughly 10 years of his life singing in what is today known as the Vienna Boys Choir. So the Vienna Boys Choir, which you may have heard of, they tour the world and they put out CDs and whatever. It's basically, at least it was back then, the choir of St. Stephen's Cathedral, or at least the boys of St. Stephen's Cathedral. And in return for his services singing in the choir of St. Stephen's, he was given room and board and a decent education. He was taught the rudiments, the basics of how to play like the keyboard and the violin. Didn't seem to have gotten much instruction in composition. I would say probably more than most any other composer, Haydn is essentially self-taught. Now, he did have, obviously he had musical instruction, like how to read music, how to play the keyboard, how to play the violin, but he was not instructed specifically in composition. However, having the position he did, singing regularly in St. Stephen's and performing the works of other composers, he probably learned quite a bit just by performing these works and sort of by osmosis and being observant. For a time later on, in his later teens, he worked as sort of a valet and accompanist for a composer named Porpora. Apparently did get some lessons from Porpora. But Haydn's main training in composition came from his own personal study, primarily of the works of C.P.E. Bach. Remember that the sons of Bach, J.S. Bach, I said were very, very influential on all the classical era composers. And in the case of Haydn, apparently he went to the library, he found all the scores, all the manuscripts of C.P.E. Bach that he could get his hands on. He would take them home, he would check them out, take them home, copy them out by hand, and in this way get to learn the style of C.P.E. Bach. So C.P.E. Bach was a tremendous, probably more influential than any other composer on Joseph Haydn. I'm not sure if they ever even got a chance to meet, because C.P.E. Bach was very, very famous. Haydn, not so much. And Haydn was virtually unknown until he was well into his 30s, and I believe by that time C.P.E. Bach had died. In any case, so Haydn is working as a choir boy in the cathedral, but of course, eventually someday his voice was going to change, which it did when he was about 16 years old. I think that's kind of late for someone's voice to be changing. And at that point, he was basically let go from from singing in the choir. You might wonder, well, why didn't he just stay on and sing with the tenors or sing as an adult male singer? Apparently, there was an incident where Haydn, who loved jokes and pranks, we can find jokes and pranks and humor in his music, actually. Apparently, Haydn was kind of mischievous, and he was standing behind one of the other boy singers and had some scissors and snipped off the boy's pigtail. Back then, men wore pigtails. And this was a breach of discipline, and it was probably just, the straw that broke the camel's back, and so Haydn was kind of dismissed. So now he has to somehow, he's 16 or 17 years old, he has to somehow eke out a living as a freelance musician in Vienna. Now, fortunately, there was a lot of work to be had. You could teach lessons, you could play, all kinds of different gigs, playing in cafes, playing for weddings, playing for funerals. Haydn even worked as a street musician. If you were walking down the street in Vienna, let's say in the late 1740s or 1750, you might see someone playing the violin out in the street with their case open, and you're supposed to throw some coins in. That could have been Joseph Haydn. So he kind of lived this starving artist existence, taking any musical jobs he could get, going to the library, checking out the music of C.P.E. Bach, trying to teach himself composition. Eventually, this kind of work paid off to the point where he was noticed by the nobility and the wealthy music lovers who tried to arrange for him to get jobs. And eventually this led to the main position that he had for 30 years, and that was as Kapellmeister or court composer to the Esterházy family. So this was, I believe, around 1761. He was hired by the Esterházys, who were the most powerful and wealthy Hungarian noble family. So the Esterházys had several residences. They had a residence in Eisenstadt. They had a place in Vienna, and they were, during the 1760s, when they hired Haydn, they were in the process of building this mammoth palace out in the boonies in rural Hungary. And whenever they traveled from one residence to another, they brought all their servants with them. They brought their musicians with them because they loved music and they liked to hear music wherever they went. So Haydn was hired by the Esterházys as their court composer, and although this was a very fortunate break for him, he was very grateful for having this position. It was a lot of work. It was back-breaking work. Constant composition and rehearsals, putting on performances of new music all the time, like several concerts a week. Haydn was also responsible for all the other musicians, so he was basically like a servant. He was like a high-ranking servant, but he was treated as a servant. He was just part of the household staff, like the cook, like the gardener, like the driver of the coach, whatever. He probably had a little more prestige than those guys, but he was considered a skilled servant. He was treated as a servant. He had to wear a uniform every day, like the butler, and all of the other musicians, like his orchestra, they were all under his supervision. So, that meant that if, let's say that, this or that musician were not performing their duties, didn't seem to be, playing very well, or were making trouble, or were getting drunk, or who knows, Haydn was responsible for them. So he had a great deal of work, great deal of responsibility. But he had a steady income. He had a roof over his head. He had a certain amount of prestige, working for the most powerful and wealthy Hungarian noble family. And crucially important for any composer, he had a guaranteed performance. Anything that he composed, it was going to be performed. This is not always the case. Composers, to this day, it's the biggest struggle for a composer. You can compose all you want, especially if you're composing orchestral music. but who's going to perform it? You know, if you are a composer of orchestral music today, you have to compose stuff and maybe send it out to different conductors and hope that they like it and hope that they will perform your piece. But for Haydn, he had his own orchestra. I mean, it was. Now, we have to consider, however, Haydn was not free to compose in whatever style he pleased. He had to compose in the style that his boss, Prince Nicholas Esterházy, favored. So he had to get to know his boss's tastes, and if he composed something that didn't seem to sit well with his boss, then he might hear about it, or he might at least get sort of a, not too much applause, and he would know not to write something like that again. He did not have complete artistic freedom, but he had a certain amount of artistic freedom, and he would, as he himself said, I was free to experiment because I had my own orchestra, and at least he wasn't dependent on some other orchestral conductor, whether they liked his music or not. As long as his boss liked his music, then he was successful. Now, one thing, when you're in a position like this, the music that you compose doesn't necessarily belong to you, because remember, you're just an employee, which means you might not necessarily get to have your music published, because the product that you create is owned by your boss, your patron. So in 1779, I believe it was, this was kind of a big year for Haydn because his contract was up for renegotiation, and he asked for and was granted permission to have his works published. So once his works are published and put into print, not only can he maybe start to earn some royalties from them, but those printed works can be distributed, and other people, other orchestras, other performers can begin to perform his works, and that way his fame, his renown would spread. Remember, this is a time before recorded music, so your stuff is not getting heard on the radio. There are no CDs or whatever, Spotify. The only way that anyone else is going to get to know your music is if they hear it live in person. And if you are a court composer of a Hungarian prince and spending most of your time in this giant palace out in the countryside, and that might mean that your work is not necessarily performed anyplace else. Well, once you have the ability to publish your work, have it copyrighted, have it distributed, then you can become quite a bit more famous. This is what happened with Haydn. So beginning in the 1780s, his work is being published, it becomes more widely distributed, his reputation outside of Central Europe begins to grow, especially in England. For whatever reason, the English, England was a very musical place. They didn't necessarily produce as many great composers as Germany, but it was a very wealthy country. They loved music. There are lots of orchestras, lots of music being put on all the time. And this will factor in a little later on. So, Haydn continues working for the Esterházy family. When we get to the early 1790s, I believe 1791 or so, his old boss, the old Count Nicholas Esterházy, dies. His son becomes the new Count, Anton. Anton, likes music, but is not as crazy about music as his father had been. Decides to cut back a little bit on some of these, cut back on staff, for example. If you are, if you have your own orchestra and your own opera house, which they did, the Esterházys had their own opera house. They put on productions of operas within the palace. So you can imagine how expensive all that is. All the musicians, all the sets that have to be made, the costumes, all these people have to be paid. Well, if you're not as big of a fan of music, as much of a music lover as your father was, you might want to cut back on some of those expenses. And again, reflecting some of the changes going on in society. A lot of the nobility were cutting back on these kinds of expenses as we get into the late 1700s. a lot of times it was seen as sort of like ostentatious. The very wealthy aristocracy were conscious of these kind of class struggles between the middle class and lower class, and the resentment of the very wealthy aristocracy, and they sometimes tried to sort of economize and deliberately play down their wealth so that they wouldn't become targets, let's say, or and this, of course, comes to a head with the French Revolution, which begins in 1789. So this is right around that time frame that we're talking about. Now, it's not necessarily as much of a problem in Austria, but it is something that throughout Europe, the aristocracy are kind of conscious of the need to not stoke resentment. And I don't know if this had anything really to do with, but as it affects Haydn, Haydn is basically allowed to go into sort of semi-retirement. He's still officially an employee of the Esterházy family, but he is basically released from having to serve in the same position like full time. They hired another composer, and Haydn was given sort of this semi-retired status, which enabled him to move back to Vienna, which was something that he always wanted to do. He is one of the other drawbacks of this position. Most of the year, the Esterházys were in this giant palace out in the countryside that they had built for themselves. But that meant that Haydn was kind of isolated out in the countryside, did not get to go to the big city as often as he would like to. Haydn returns to Vienna, and just about immediately upon returning to Vienna, there is a concert promoter, kind of impresario guy named J.P. Salomon. He's an Englishman. And he has written to Haydn. He's written letters to Haydn saying, look, I know you're sort of going into this semi-retirement from the Esterházy family. Don't make any plans until I have a chance to talk to you, because I have an exciting opportunity for you. I can arrange for performances of your works in England. You can come with me over to England, and we'll put on a series of concerts. You'll make a whole bunch of money. You'll get to meet royalty. You get to meet the king and queen. And so this is what Haydn does. For the first time in his life, he travels overseas in 1792, I believe, for the first time. He actually makes two separate trips to England, each one lasting about a year. And during the course of that year, he composes. So this is, for example, when during these trips to England, the London symphonies, the so-called London symphonies, the last 12 symphonies of Haydn, are composed. He also composes oratorios for performance in England in the English language. Remember how the English loved the oratorios of Handel. So now we have Haydn giving performances, composing oratorios with texts in English, a favorite genre of the English audiences. And he is indeed treated like royalty there. He does meet the king and queen, and he's given an honorary doctoral degree from Oxford University. So Haydn is really kind of like a rock star in England. And these two visits to England are sort of like kind of like the peak of his career. I mean, come a long way from the son of a wheelwright from a little tiny village in the backwoods of Austria-Hungary. Now, essentially, the greatest composer in the world. And at the time of his death, well, I'm skipping ahead a little bit to his death, but in his old age, let's say, Haydn was regarded as the greatest living composer. Because by that time, Mozart, who we will talk about in the next lecture, Mozart died in 1791. And unfortunately, the last few years of Mozart's life, although Mozart was as a phenomenal child prodigy, was basically the most famous musician in Europe when he was in his single-digit years, in his teen years, in his adulthood, he had a bit of a struggle. And we'll talk about that when we get to that next lecture. But Mozart in his later years was actually not as popular as Haydn was. For a few years after Mozart's death, his music was kind of forgotten, and Mozart kind of struggled the last few years, struggled with his career, not with composition. He was among the greatest composers of all time, but he struggled with his career. He struggled financially. Audiences in his later years were maybe not as keen on his music as he would have liked, particularly in Vienna. But Haydn, so especially after the death of Mozart in 1791, this is a time when Beethoven was not yet considered the greatest. Beethoven was born in 1770, actually had some composition lessons with Haydn as a young man. So in that in-between time, let's say, between the passing of Mozart and the rise of Beethoven, Haydn is considered the greatest composer in the world. Haydn himself, by the way, considered Mozart to be the greatest composer. He even said to Mozart's father, he said, "Your son is the greatest composer known to me." And he's saying that about a guy who is, like almost 30 years younger than him. Let's see, 24 years younger. So that's quite a, for a, 44-year-old man to be saying that about a 20-year-old. Your son is the greatest composer known to me. I mean, that's quite something. Anyway, Haydn's last few years, unfortunately, last 5 or 6 years of his life, he was pretty ill. He was in his 70s. He wasn't able to compose, although he was still mentally sharp. He was not in very good health. When he died in 1809, it just so happened that Haydn was, basically was on his deathbed in the spring of 1809. This is when Napoleon was occupying Vienna, or let's say bombarding Vienna. He was trying to take the city of Vienna, had it surrounded by cannon. And someone brought it to Napoleon's attention that Haydn was still in the city, which was under cannon fire, and couldn't be moved because he was dying. Napoleon, this shows, how much respect Haydn, how much respect people had for Haydn. Napoleon arranged for an honor guard of French troops to go down into the city, find Haydn's house, and stand guard and make sure that nothing bad happened, despite the ravages of war. So again, sort of a testament to the esteem in which the entire musical world held Haydn. The characteristics of his music, they pointed out, first of all, Haydn composed in all of the different genres of this time and composed prolifically. 104 symphonies, I believe 62 piano sonatas, 68 string quartets, many, many operas, although his operas aren't performed very much today. Lots of church music. Haydn was a devout Catholic, composed masses, composed oratorios, as I've said, composed many, many concertos for various different instruments. There's probably about a dozen keyboard concertos, although only 1 or 2 of them are played regularly. There's that trumpet concerto I just played for you. I believe there are 4 or 5 violin concertos for many, many other instruments. Just a very prolific composer. There's a lot of humor in his work very often. There are a couple of famous examples of this. There's, remember the Surprise Symphony. I played the second movement, where we have this theme, which is, very, it's stated initially pretty, it's quiet and gentle and slow, and then it's restated even softer, and then you get this bang, this loud chord, as if Haydn sort of lulling you to sleep and then hitting you with that super loud chord. There's a symphony by Haydn called the Farewell Symphony, which in the last movement, now Haydn was trying to his musicians were complaining that it was time for their break. It was time for their time off so that they could, they were given a vacation. They were allowed to travel, and apparently his musicians were grumbling that, like, when are we going to get our time? When is the Count going to give us our time off, our break, so that we can travel? So what Haydn did as a sort of to give the hint is he composed this symphony where in the last movement, one by one, the instruments cut out. They come to a stop, and then they're supposed to pack their instrument into their case, get up, and leave the stage until all that's left, I believe, is just one player on stage. I forget which instrument it is, but this is sort of like Haydn's way of saying, look, we're anxious to leave now. So that's the farewell symphony. There's a string quartet of Haydn's where it's written into the music. It sounds as if the players are like losing their place or having a memory slip. So lots of little sort of pranks and little in-jokes in Haydn's music. He was a sort of a very humble, apparently a very easy to get along with type of guy, and again had a nice sense of humor. Okay, so that kind of wraps it up for Haydn. And next time we will focus on Mozart. We'll listen to some excerpts from his opera Don Giovanni, and then we will conclude things with some lectures on Beethoven. See you then.